Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our midday healthcare merger and acquisition, buying or selling a medical practice webinar. My name is Stephen White, and I will be your host and moderator today for this session. And I want to thank you all, each of you, for taking time out of your day to be a part of this webinar today. And it's actually the third of a three-part webinar series that we've been hosting during the course of this summer. We started off this summer by working in the healthcare industry and focusing on specifically three different professions: the veterinarian, the dental practice, and of course, in yours. Our first series that we kicked, first webinar that we kicked off in this series, we focused on the PPP loan, where we addressed veterinarians as far as the forgiveness process. And then we turned to the dental practice and focused on the estate planning and exit strategies. And I know in the midst of everything that's going on right now, estate planning was probably not at the top of their minds, but throughout the course of that discussion, they began to realize the importance of, God forbid, anything should ever happen to you. Think about what happens to your practice. Think about what happens to your partners. Think about what happens to your family. So that was an in-depth conversation. And then today, of course, we get an opportunity to talk about the buying and the selling of a practice. So we're excited about this. And again, my name is Stephen White. I'm not only the moderator and the host for you today, I'm actually the managing partner of the firm that's hosting this event, Onyx Partners Group. And Onyx Partners Group is a business valuation advisory firm in which we and my partners, we provide a variety of valuation services, such as establishing buy-sell agreements, providing valuations for gift and estate valuations, SBA valuations, and of course, we provide valuations for what we're doing today, acquisition and sales as well. However, today is not about providing valuation advice and services. Even though I believe everything begins and ends with valuations, there's a number of different things that need to be addressed and discussed as it pertains to buying or selling a medical practice. In fact, how all of this really came about, this topic of discussion, is because as we provide valuation services for the medical field, we tend to revisit those physicians just to talk with them and see how things are going in their overall transaction or the transition into another area, and to find out how things have been going. And what we found by doing so is a reoccurring theme. Hearing from the physicians say, if I knew then what I know now, that transition probably would have been a little different. And right there, we realized that's the topic of our discussion. And so because we asked them additional questions as, tell me a little bit more about your team that you put together. And the responses that they shared, some of them were good, some of them were okay, but they weren't specialists in their particular field. So today, we were able to assemble a panel I like to call an all-stars of experts in their own respective fields. We put together a panel of individuals that are experienced in their fields, that work on areas such as this day in and day out. And we wanted to collect them and bring them together today so they can share some of their knowledge, their experience for you, the audience, so that you have an opportunity to address them as well as talk about some of the things that you should be aware of as you go through the process. So let me take a moment now just to introduce this panel. And I'm going to start off with our expert from the legal field. We're going to start with Michael Schnipper. As you can see on the screen here, Michael is a partner at Nixon Peabody, where he represents clients in all types of corporate transactions, including mergers and acquisition, private equity, venture capital, joint ventures. Michael also has a depth of experience in the healthcare, life science, and technology industry. One key point about Michael that I will share, and he probably is a little embarrassed for me to say this, but Best Lawyers of America also recognized Michael as the Lawyer of the Year in healthcare in the Long Island market in 2019, which is a huge accomplishment. So I'm grateful to have him as a part of this team as well. And then next, we're going to go over to Louis de la Prida. Lou is a managing partner and principal of the NYBB group and the NYBB commercial real estate, where he works closely with clients that are looking for an intermediary to represent them in the purchase or the sale of their business, as well as real estate. He works with clients such as yourselves in the healthcare industry for entrepreneurs, private equity groups, as well as lower middle management group. Welcome, Lou. And then lastly, our expert in the accounting world, we have Lee Ferber. Lee, who has been a partner with Gettry Marcus CPA since 1999. He is a partner in charge of the firm's business advisory group and virtual accounting service group. Now, as a co-chair with the healthcare consulting group, Lee provides services in accounting, tax, audit, consulting services to group practices, ambulatory surgery centers, diagnostic and treatment facilities, urgent care centers, and a host of other things as well. So, gentlemen, welcome to our webinar today. We have a host of a lot of questions and things that we want to dive into. But I have to tell you, this session is really about you, the audience out there today, because we have the expertise and they have knowledge in this area, but it's you that is going through this. So at any time you have any questions for the panel, please utilize the chat box, type in your questions, and I'll be certain to pull them out and share them along with the panel so we can address them at that point in time. But until you decide to ask a question, why don't we get things started with, from my perspective, from a valuation world perspective, looking at the healthcare medical field in 2019. The way we looked at it, and I like to look at things as the glass half full, I felt like the medical industry was prospering and doing extremely well. I mean, in fact, IBS World actually gave a forecast of the growth of this industry at a modest rate of around 2.5% to 3% over the next 3 to 5 years, which is conservative, but still growing. And in fact, if you add in the industry value, which is the value that's added into the economy, it was going to outpace the GDP over the next 3 to 5 years. You add in the healthcare reform and the demand for primary care, this is probably a very good industry to be in as far as from a valuations perspective. But like I said, you need that team of professionals in that area. So this might be a great transition to start off with you, Lou. Tell us a little bit about what your thoughts were, and then we'll move to Lee and then end up with Mike as far as what your thoughts were as far as the medical industry in 2019.
Excellent. So first of all, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you, Steve, for having us. Let's start off on a good note. So as Steve mentioned, right, for years, healthcare was one of the hottest sectors in the M&A world, and the ambulatory services group or subsector has benefited from that interest. And I think that constitutes the vast majority of the people on this call. And there have been a few major trends that have driven sector outperformance. On the macroeconomic front, many of the things that have benefited pretty much every industry in the M&A world has also benefited healthcare. And you're familiar with those. Those are a strong economy, a thriving stock market, and a low interest rate environment. For healthcare in particular, though, it has also benefited from favorable demographics, in particular the aging of the population. On the macro front, there are three things that have really helped the healthcare industry. The first has been healthcare reform, which Steve cited, and for some that is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, the Affordable Care Act introduced new subscribers into the system. Those are potential sources of revenue, and then the ACA and other initiatives have created an environment that, for lack of a better word, have made it so that kind of like to encourage mergers. The industry also historically has been viewed as one that is recession resistant, although I recognize that there are some people on the call that might quibble with that statement. And then lastly, the industry has benefited from fragmentation. There's a term that's used by M&A advisors that focus on healthcare. They often call, ambulatory services groups as onesies, twosies, and that refers to groups that usually have one location or two locations. And in fact, even though there has been a significant amount of consolidation over the last decade in the different groups, whether it's medical, physical therapy, and so on, the industry is still largely fragmented. And that does a couple of things. First, it creates a large addressable submarket of companies that are out there that can be acquired for not a very, very high multiple and that can be incorporated into the operations of a larger group. And so what that has done effectively is that it has enticed larger groups to focus aggressively on consolidating the practice landscape. And this has been particularly important in this environment where increasingly regulations and the cost of healthcare are causing all participants in the healthcare system to look to provide care in venues that are less costly than they have historically been.
Thank you, Lou. Lee?
Yeah, so I'll probably be repeating some of what Lou just said, but talking more in terms of financial, because as an accountant, that's the kind of the world we live in. So, I think you have to look back in a few years to look at what really triggered the selling of medical practices. And it goes back to just the age of the providers, baby boomers getting older. We need to figure out, how they're going to exit or sell an interest in their practice. Investments in technology are significant, whether it's historically EMRs, practice analytics. Now, practices have no choice but to invest in telemedicine, population health management. And of course, we all hear about the transition from fee for service to value based payment systems, which is causing a whole series of investments to be made by physician owners. So basically, physician owners are saying at this point that there's a big administrative burden, big cost to continue. Do they want to continue to invest, or are they looking for opportunities to sell an interest? And now you overlay the pandemic on top of it. I can tell you a lot of small, practitioners are saying, I don't really want to come back to the office. There's not much there for me anymore. I'm concerned about my health. So I think we'll get past that, but that's what we're hearing. So years ago, it was hospitals. What we heard about was hospitals acquiring practices, and that was essentially giving employment agreements to retiring physicians and their employed physicians. Now, for the last years, it's been a really hot market for private equity. And like Lou said, the driving factor is healthcare is still a very fragmented market, and there's still a lot of opportunities for private equity to consolidate practices and grow. So we see it in dermatology, ophthalmology, women's health, urology, GI. Historically, it's kind of slowed up, but we see it. We still see it in orthopedics. We still see a lot of opportunity in urgent care, a very fragmented market. And we're starting to see more and more even primary care as add-ons to larger practices. And in the dental world, anyone that's a dentist knows of dental service organizations. They're essentially owned by private equity as well. So I'm going to give a 30-second just overview of what the private equity strategy is, which I think will give some good insight into what's going on with private equity. So, typically what happens is private equity will look in a market and find a practice that they could basically acquire a majority interest, and we call it a platform practice. It doesn't have to be the largest in a regional market. It could be 4 to 5 offices, 5 to 10 million in earnings, maybe 10 to 15 providers, not huge. But it's a good, stable practice that they invest in. So they acquire an interest, however they do it, through whatever vehicle in that practice, and then they grow it. Like every private equity wants to do, they want to grow their investment for their investors. So what do? They now acquire smaller practices, what we call add-ons. Well, the small practices out there, or a lot of them, depending on the specialty they're in and the size and the region they're in, maybe getting calls from these platform practices in ophthalmology and dermatology. Come join us. We have a large regional group in the area. We'd love you to come on, and we're willing to pay you some type of multiple of your earnings. You're not going to get the same earnings as you did as the platform practice. That was the first large practice in the area, but there are opportunities, for multiples there. And once the private equity grows this way, they'll add ancillaries. They could add surgery centers, labs, diagnostic tests. And that's how they grow the service lines and also actively recruit physicians. So that's where things are. The market was really hot in 17, 18, and 19 in private equity and healthcare. It slowed up a little bit, but we'll talk, I guess, after about post-pandemic. But I still think it will be and continue to be a very active market, especially private equity.
That's great. Well, that brings me to an interesting point of where we were, like Lou stated, that, start on a high note. And of course, 2020 happens. We start off the year really well, and then boom, February, March, and it seems like the whole world gets turned upside down. But to Lou's point, activity is still going on out there, which brings me to the legal aspect of all of this. And Mike, I'm going to turn towards you here. looking now, we can't do anything about the past, but as we move forward and into our new norm, how should physicians and medical practice look at this from a legal perspective as far as either they plan on buying or selling a practice?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for putting this together. And sort of good segue from what Lee and Lou were just discussing. Right, we came into the pandemic in an exceptionally bear market, bull market for healthcare transactions. And coming out of the pandemic, I've heard a lot of discussion about a bear market in M&A. And I participated recently in a industry agnostic M&A webinar, and there was a lot of discussion not about healthcare but about M&A generally, and there is a bearish position from advisors, and I think you're going to see in other industries a lot of distressed assets, and the expectation is that will be for the balance of 2020 and into 21. Don't feel that way about healthcare. I think there was certainly a significant pause in activity when the work from home orders were initiated. And I think there were a lot of deals in pipelines that went on pause. But as recently as just a few weeks ago, pencils are back up. The transactions appear to be active again. I think we'll start to see some new transactions. And I'm not talking about distressed assets. I'm talking about healthy companies. So from the legal perspective, if you're not already under an LOI or in discussions with a buyer or seller, depending on which side of the transaction you're on, I still think there's opportunity. And before entering the market, it's important to get your shop in order. Speak with advisors like the folks on the panel, intermediaries, your accountant, your attorney, valuation experts like Stephen, and start to understand what, if you're a seller, a buyer is going to be looking at, and start to get your paperwork in order. That ranges from your accounting to your tax to your legal documents, because you don't want to be flat-footed when you start engaging in real dialogue about a transaction, whether it's a discussion about transaction structure or transaction price. It's just important to do an internal housekeeping before you enter the market. I would have said that pre-pandemic, but it's even more important post-pandemic because although there's an active deal market, there's certainly more scrutiny than there was pre-pandemic.
Good. You just said something that was pretty interesting, and I'm pretty sure everybody already knows what this means, but just in case if there are a couple out there in the audience that are not clear on this, you mentioned you used an acronym, LOI. Why don't you just give briefly a little overview exactly what is an LOI, because that's a very important part of the process.
Sure. So an LOI is a letter of intent. They come in varying shapes and sizes, but traditionally they're the first written agreement between a buyer and seller. They tend to lay out the very high-level deal terms, often preceding material due diligence, but it is the parties laying out in a document what the expectation of the transaction is. And based on that understanding, the parties agree to commit the time and resources to actually proceeding with the transaction. So that's when you really get into due diligence, document drafting, and negotiation. I think it's rare, but not unheard of, to proceed with a transaction without an LOI. The nice thing about the LOI is that it sets expectations up front, and it also eliminates people having foggy memories as you get down the path of what the actual deal terms are. You can always revert back to what was in your letter of intent.
Right. Thank you for that.
And Steve, could I make a couple of quick comments about the current state of affairs in the M&A world? Okay. So, as was pointed out, like activity in the first quarter actually was pretty consistent with historical range of activity. And in Q2, it actually wasn't down as much as you would expect, given the fact that a pandemic took place. But even so, I don't think we can overestimate the pandemic's impact on practices, in particular as it relates to the finances and the operations of the practices. So, for example, I know we have like a host, a very broad range of practice types that are on this call. But if you look at it, depending on the industry, whether it's dental or whether it's medical, estimates of visit volume dropping has been anywhere in the 60 to 80% range, depending on the type of practice. And that obviously has had an impact on both the revenues and the profitability of the practices. And not surprisingly, the management teams of the typical healthcare practice has been not so much focused on M&A as they have really on actively deploying resources and devoting time and activities to really, to manage the crisis itself, right? And so I think with that as a background, there are three, broad observations that I'd like to make about the current environment, right? And one is the importance of strategic rationale has never been greater. In fact, when you look at the deals that are still being done in this environment, those are the ones that have the strongest strategic rationale. The second point is that there's an increased need for participants to be flexible, and that's happening as we speak. Some deals are actually being accelerated. So those that, for example, were already in the due diligence phase or very, very close to closing, they're going through the process or processes of doing whatever needs to be done in order to close these deals. And the ones that were not have actually been put on hold. You're seeing in many cases that huge deals are not being done, little deals are not being done. And it's more kind of like a lot of like the middle market deals that Ferber alluded to before are getting done. And then the last point is that anyone going forward, no matter what side of the transaction you're in, you should expect to see a much greater evaluation of the risks and the different alternatives in the deal. And I think that that's the subject of some future questions that you have for us.
That's excellent. That's three excellent points there. And I just maybe started thinking of some of the risk and some of the processes that need to be undertaken. And I was thinking more from the accounting perspective. So Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you, because even in the process of thinking about selling your practice or buying into a practice, there are some financial and tax considerations that need to be addressed as well. And this is an area of your expertise, and I figure we might as well have this conversation, especially on tax day, right?
Absolutely. No, we're just getting through July 15th, the new April 15th. So I'm actually in pretty good shape, thankfully. So when you look at deals like Mike was saying before, many deals fall apart because there's just not a lot of confidence in the historical financial information. So that's key. You have to have good accounting records, putting aside all the legal aspects, having all your legal documents in place. But the way I look at it is, dollars and cents, because that's what we're really talking about for someone looking to sell an interest. So when we talk about, preparing a practice for a sale, and it should start in a perfect world, 2-3 years before a sale. Make sure you start building up a good book of information. We strongly suggest preparing what's called a quality of earnings analysis, or a scaled down version, which quite frankly is less costly, which we'll just call a normalized earnings analysis. And this is essentially a 3 to 5 year analysis of historical adjusted earnings, adjusting earnings for perks such as entertainment, above market compensation. Perhaps a physician owner is paying his spouse an excessive compensation. It could be excessive compensation just to the physician owner. Fair market value rent adjustments. Many practices own the buildings where they provide services and their rents are above fair market value. Those should be adjusted. And also normalizing or adding back, which is essentially increasing earnings for other non-recurring or one-time expenses, whether they're legal, recruitment fees, one-time consulting expense, and just a whole slew of other add-backs and or adjustments just based on a detailed review of the historical expenses. We also strongly suggest that you identify the costs that might be absorbed by a buyer. So if you have a platform practice that already has an infrastructure, they may not need your full billing department, your full accounting department. So you want to at least be able to present to them what costs might go away or be absorbed. When you think about it in the end, you have to look at it from the other side. If you're a seller, you have to look at, if you're on the other side as an investor, what would you be concerned about? You're given all this financial information. You need to be able to really concisely evaluate the practice's financial health. And that's what a qualified earnings or normalized earnings analysis does. You need to evaluate whether you can rely on those earnings and they accurately represent the earnings of the company, and you could use that to reflect future earnings, because at the end of the day, you're going to fold this practice you're acquiring into your existing operations. So I'll give a very quick example just to give the point. When you understand that valuation is based on earnings and multiples of what someone is willing to pay, if you could present to a buyer the best depiction of your practice and really show the value proposition, not just the net bottom line profitability, but show the real value of the practice. I'll give a simple example. You could have a practice that has earnings or EBITDA of $10 million. And you could provide just your normal historical accounting information, some normalized adjustments, and maybe you'll come up with a multiple of 5. 5 times 10 million earnings is a $50 million enterprise value. You sell at 50% interest, you got $25 million in your pocket. Perfect world, simple scenario, round numbers. Now you go ahead and you dig into the numbers, provide a better depiction of the practice. And by doing that, there'll be a higher valuation. Instead of 5 times earnings, maybe it'll be 6 times earnings. 6 times 10 million or 60 million. You sell a $500,000 interest for $30 million. $30 million versus 25 is $5 million. So more times than not, you just, by providing just a stronger depiction or analysis of the value of a practice through some type of financial quality of earnings or normalized earnings analysis, you can end up with with greater dollars in your pocket. Even using this example, even a half a point multiple, going from a 5 multiple to 5.5, will net another $500,000 in your pocket. So we're big proponents of preparing early, strategizing early, so you get a higher multiple and a higher valuation. And this goes on the buyer side as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. Thank you for that. You brought up some really interesting things, especially Adbacks, and we'll talk about the Adbacks later on. But I also wanted to take a turn here, because we have a group of people that are not all in New York. Some of them have logged in from different states, New Jersey and other states. And I know from a valuation perspective, we can provide valuations anywhere for any particular practice or position. But I also know that there's different things that need to be taken into consideration from a legal perspective of you buying another practice someplace else. So, Mike, why don't you give us a little overview of exactly what physicians should look at if they live in New Jersey or their practice is in New Jersey and they want to expand, say, to New York, or vice versa?
Yeah, that's a good point. And let me start off with everything that Lou and Lee and I have said so far is applicable in every state that you could do a deal in. Where you get into the different state issues is when you get into certain regulatory restrictions. I mentioned earlier that I was on a call with M&A advisors, not in the healthcare industry. So widget makers can do a deal anywhere in the country, and essentially it's the same structure. But when you deal with a highly regulated area like healthcare, you need to be aware of the regulations in your applicable state. So the most common issue for a different state is who may own the practice and the corporate practice of medicine. So New York and New Jersey are really on the same page there. Similar to accountants and lawyers, the owner of the practice must be licensed in the profession. So if you're selling a practice to another provider with a similar license or the same license, then it's an easy transaction and you don't have to go through various hoops to address regulatory issues. But I believe early on in this discussion, Lee mentioned the idea of private equity investment and management service organizations. And the idea and the genesis of management service organizations is really to address a restriction on the corporate practice of medicine, and that exists in New York and New Jersey. And a private equity firm is not permitted to directly acquire an interest in a clinical entity. So I won't rehash what Lee went over, but essentially, if you form a business organization that provides non-clinical administrative and management services, that can be owned by non-licensed individuals, non-licensed entities, and can provide management and administrative services to a clinical entity, but the owner of that clinical entity must be licensed. And at the very early stages of a transaction, you do need to look at what your state restrictions are. This is probably more advice for a buyer because we have buy-side clients that do transactions in a lot of different states. And it's easy when they call me and say they're going to do a deal in New York or New Jersey because we so often practice there. But in other states, we do have to determine who an eligible owner is. Some states require that you be licensed in that state. Some states allow you to be licensed in another state. Some states allow corporate ownership. There is no restriction on corporate ownership. So that is like a threshold issue, and it should be addressed up front because the last thing you want to do is enter into a letter of intent and start negotiating a transaction that's not permissible in your state.
If I could just add one thing, Steve, regarding management service organizations or MSOs. So we recently had one really good success story. It was a large specialty practice that sold just before the pandemic. They just got it under the wire. We spun off an MSO at the end of 2015. And what that means is you basically transfer all the non-clinical assets from the clinical practice to the management service organization. And then, as well as all the employees, all the non-clinical employees and the rents or whatever are now paid through the management service organization. When we did that at the end of 15, it was done with the expectation that the owner, who was getting up there in age, wanted to have an exit strategy to private equity. So at the same time as that the MSO was created, we gifted interest through trust to his children and other family members, which are allowed because the MSO is not owned by a licensed physician. And 3 years later, lo and behold, they sold the interest. And when we did the valuation early on, back in 2015, the MSO had a very low valuation. There was no history. There was no offer on the table. And the owner was able to gift significant interest to the trust for his children. Long story short, it rolled forward 3.5 years to March 2020 when they sold. It was at a much higher multiple, much higher valuation, and essentially through estate planning and a low valuation early on, they were able to essentially pass on those proceeds and the tax of that to the next generation as part of their trust and estate planning. So the MSO is, like Steve said, like Mike said, is clearly a vehicle. We see it a lot in transactions. If you're the right size practice, it makes sense to do. If it's set up the right way, it's not that much of an administrative burden to maintain. But you start having this structure in place, which is, I think, what Mike was alluding to.
Mm-hmm. We actually have a question from our audience. In my case, the physician owns both the MSO and the operating company.
And that's not uncommon. That is, I think, someone who's doing a lot of forward thinking, because I've done transactions where the physician or physicians have a growth strategy and have a plan to go to market. And by putting the MSO in place, they can open up the potential investors to non-licensed individuals and already have the structure in place. You could also do a transaction where you're operating solely through the clinical entity, seek non-licensed investment like a private equity firm, and as part of that transaction, create the MSO. But already having it in place kind of makes the story that Lou needs to present when he goes to market a little easier because he can talk about eligible owners and it can be non-licensed individuals in the MSO.
Yeah, and I'll add to that what Mike said. It is very forward thinking. So you could have this physician may have 2 locations, and he or she has plans over the next 3 to 5 years to expand to 10 locations. So it gives value to the management company, which is the entity that ultimately is going to be sold to private equity, is the fact that they have a long-term management agreement, and the management fee they receive is going to grow because they're now managing a larger practice or practices. So again, that's, even if, like I said before, it's not an administrative burden to set up a management company if you foresee growth in the future. And then Mike and Mike and the attorneys can then make sure all the agreements and structure is in place. So I think it's very forward thinking, and that's probably somebody who's looking to grow the practice with a view at some point in the future to sell.
Excellent point. And he said, thank you very much for that response. And I appreciate the question also coming in. I do want to shift gears a little. Something in your bio, Lou, that you have as far as you being that intermediary for either the buyer or the seller. So walk us through that process. How does that really work? How do you get involved? And once you're involved, what exactly do you do for our physician and practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think your question is meant more on the sell side. Am I correct?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. So when you look at it on the sell side, right? Typically, this is a physician or a healthcare group that is considered selling, right? And the one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes when you think about selling, you don't just necessarily have to sell your practice outright. There are many physicians that actually want to stay on in some way, shape, or form. And in the healthcare world, in fact, it's very common that you can either buy, sell, or partner. And so one of the very first things that we do is that we help physicians or practice owners explore their exit options. And the key thing here to consider is that there are often more than one way to do that. The second thing is we help them come up with the most probable selling price. Time after time, no matter what the industry, buyers always want to know what they can sell their practice for. And you can do it in many ways. You can do it either through something known as a broker opinion of value, or you could do a full-blown valuation, which is something that we would delegate to someone such as yourself, Steve. But once somebody has decided to sell, we work with them to create a process to attract quality buyers and quality suitors. And that really is the key, right? There's no magic bullet. You're not going to list your practice and all of a sudden you're going to get 100 different people bidding on that practice. You have to follow all of the different steps to ensure that you get the maximum selling price, right? And so the way that we do it is we do it first by researching the market of the different buyers that are available. And that will vary. For the most part in healthcare, there'll be a lot of the same types of buyers. So there'll be strategic investors, there'll be private equity groups, or maybe an insurance company. But it does vary a little bit from practice type to practice type, and also within certain geographies. So for instance, there may be some areas of the country where the big consolidators, private equity groups are very active, and then there may be others where the hospitals really are the terminal owner of some of those facilities. We also help them prepare their marketing book, which effectively helps them tell their story. Lee alluded to this before, where a big part of the value of your firm is driven by the numbers, but in the healthcare practices are in the business of making people well. And so the story is not just the numbers. The story really is beyond the numbers. If you really think about it, I remember when I used to be the chief operating officer of a medical group, and whenever I would knock on a door, before I knocked on the door, the owners of my practice had already reached out to everybody that they knew to ask about who owned that practice, to make sure that it was a well-run practice and they took care of their patients very, very well. And so it's very important to be able to tell that in your story. And then from there, it's key to start to market yourself and put together the package. So how are you going to reach out to them? If you were selling, let's say, your a piece of real estate, you would go to a real estate broker and they would put you on the multiple listing service. Well, guess what? There is no multiple listing service for smaller practices and for M&A in general. And so you have to often rely on both a combination of online and offline methods in order to really get your story across. And then just a couple of other things that we help buyers with. We help them as the offers come in. We work with the parties to negotiate the price and the terms, and also to give some type of advice on how to structure the transaction. We'll defer a lot to accountants such as Lee and attorneys such as Mike to really kind of like hone in on that, because they're the experts in tax and accounting and in legal, but we do play a role in that. And then in the later stages, we set up the data room to store the due diligence documents, and we work with all of the seller's advisors to help them go to closing.
Great points there. And you brought me to going back into the valuation process of when we do our valuations, much like all valuators, they should do a due diligence as far as taking a look at the different agreements and partnerships that are out there. And I know that their practices, they have multiple partners that are there. And it made me think about the partnership agreements and other forms of partnership agreements that should be reviewed or discussed. So Mike, give us a little overview as far as how agreements fall into this process, or any other type of partnerships.
Well, so agreements are essential to getting from the meeting to closing. You're going to deal with agreements, historically what exists. And just like a non-healthcare transaction, you're going to look at your key deal documents, your real estate lease, your employment agreements, your key vendor agreements. Specific to healthcare, when you review those documents, you're not just looking at the terms and the risks and the key terms of the agreement. You're also looking to ensure compliance with all the various healthcare regulations. So that's part of the due diligence. You're also going to have this other layer that's specific to healthcare. Spend a fair amount of time talking about payer rates and payer agreements, and that gets to the financials of the business. And Lee and Luke spend a fair amount of time figuring out what the rates are, the stickiness of the rates, what the rates will be post-transaction. So that's all sort of backward looking. And then, of course, what I think you're alluding to, Stephen, is the deal documents. And if it's a partnership where the seller and the buyer will both have an interest going forward, there'll be some form of operating agreement depending on the type of entity you have, whether it's a shareholders agreement or an LLC operating agreement. And those are heavily negotiated documents that govern the life of the business after the closing, everything from governance to profit sharing to restrictive covenants.
Thank you. So we had a question that came in that goes right back to you, Lou. What is the fee for such a consulting service? For example, the marketing book for a potential PE sounds like a great idea. And they also go on that. I'm sorry, and they also go on to state we've been trying to sell for 2 years now, have one failed deal and on our hands already. So I guess the marketing book is probably one of the things. So maybe you can expound upon that a little.
Okay, so first I would say to that person that they could reach out to me, and I, gladly have a complimentary consultation with them. My email is lou@nybbinc.com, and gladly share that with them. It's a little tough sometimes to talk about the actual fees in the M&A world because there are like different restrictions against talking about that. But I can speak broadly about how it works for a sell-side engagement, right? Most M&A advisors will follow some hybrid or some modification of the so-called Lehman formula, which refers to the old Lehman Brothers company, where typically in their transactions they would charge a success fee that was based on a decreasing scale. And Lehman, obviously being a bulge bracket firm, typically started their fee at around 5% and then decreased it by 1 percentage point for each successive tranche of enterprise value of the firm. For us, and for firms such as us in the lower middle market and middle market, we usually start at around 9% success fee for transactions with enterprise values below $1 million, and then we decrease it for each successive $1 million in enterprise value. And by the time that, let's say for the selling price of a company is, let's say, in the $5 million range, we're probably at around 5% all in. We do have some instances where we will do some type of advisory or some consulting arrangements for clients that have already been in the midst of a transaction, but those are more one-offs, and I would rather actually speak to it, separately with whoever is interested.
No, that's an excellent answer. Thank you so much. Hopefully that addressed that answer or question. Time is flying by really quickly here, and I still have a list of other questions here to ask, but I would like to shift gears slightly As I mentioned to you, we've been running webinars throughout the summer, and we focused on a couple of different unique professions within the healthcare. And a couple of them reached out to me from the veterinary and the dental practice, reached out to me and knew the title of this session about the buying or selling. It's medical practice, but what about veterinarians and what about the dental practices? Is the process similar, or is it completely a different conversation altogether? So whatever insights that you guys can share with us, I think they would greatly appreciate hearing from you.
Steve, I'll give you a very concise answer.
Okay.
Whether it's veterinary, whether it's dental, it's essentially the exact same process, at least from the financial standpoint. The revenue streams may be different, the operating structure may be different, but it's the same process. You want to present the best depiction to the buyer, or if you're a buyer, you want to understand what you're buying. So as concisely as I could say it, it's the same process.
Yeah, and I agree with Lee 100%. The where you actually see the differences are often in the due diligence phase, right? As you can imagine, veterinary is completely different from internal medicine, may be completely different from a dental practice. And so the types of questions that are going to be asked during due diligence to corroborate, the different value drivers for each company are going to vary, right? So, for instance, dental may have some aspects of dental may have a greater cash component than maybe a traditional medical practice. They may have either less or different payer mixes, right? And so that might be a factor. Obviously, veterinary relative to all the others have a different patient type, right? But so you're going to get asked a lot of different questions. But I'm often amazed by when it comes to like the M&A process, how similar every sale is. Not just the sale of a healthcare group, but you'd be surprised by how similar selling a medical practice is to selling a dry cleaner. It's the same process. What you're trying to do is you're trying to craft tell your story, entice as many buyers to really kind of like ask for more information and convince them that you are an honest, competent person that will be there to help them once they buy your practice and transition it to that new owner. I think that this is common to all businesses, not just healthcare, and for sure not just certain sectors or subsectors within healthcare.
Sure. Mike, you were going to add something?
Yeah, consistent with Lee and Lou, fundamentally, they're the same. And I think everything we've discussed is applicable to veterinary and to dental. What I would say, and I think Lou was getting there, is all deals kind of start the same, and the structure discussions and the deal documents are all virtually the same. But every deal is different, and you have to look at what the seller is selling. So even within medical, there's all different types. Like sometimes we find a medical practice where they own a ambulatory surgery center, and there's a licensed entity, and we need to deal with Department of Health approval in certain states. When you do a dental deal, it's a different analysis than, say, an orthodontic deal, because the contracts with patients for an orthodontist are different than the relationship with a dentist. So really, at a high level, they're all the same, and all of the things we've discussed apply to all. But when we get a new client, whether it's buy side or sell side, we look at the assets of the seller to determine what we need to address, both from a due diligence perspective, as Lou mentioned, but also from a third-party consent, government consent perspective, from a potential liability perspective. We did a large eye deal recently where there were clinical trials and drugs involved. So that was a whole nother area that we had to spend a fair amount of time analyzing and addressing in the deal documents.
Excellent. So we have enough time for a couple more questions that I'd like to throw out, but one I want to revisit, and I can't recall which one of you brought it up. It may have been you, Lee. We were discussing Adbacks, and I know that's something that comes up, especially in the transaction side. So if you gentlemen could just enlighten the audience a little bit, first of all, exactly what is an Adback and how does that apply to transaction?
So I'll give an example. You could have a practice, and I'll use some very simple numbers, that has $1 million of net income after all expenses. And you look at, say, 3 years of earnings, and 1 year it's $1 million, 1 year it's $1.5 million, 1 year it's $1.2 million. Let's say in the 1 year where it's $1.2 million, there were one-time legal expenses of $100,000. So that those expenses will not recur. It's just a one-time non-recurring expense. So we'll add back that $100,000 expense, which netted $1.2 million in net income, to increase the net income or the EBITDA to $1.3 million. Let's say in that 1 year there was the practice opened up a new location. That location is doing great 3 years later, but in that year that location had a $100,000 loss. We would add back that $100,000 loss. So now you're at $1.3 million. You add back another $100,000. That practice in that year had normalized or adjusted earnings of $1.4 million. Then you look at all the perks. You have physicians who may put through a lot of entertainment expenses. That could be $50,000 of expenses. Post-transaction, those expenses would be limited. They'd basically be given a certain amount they could use every year for entertainment. We add back that. So what you're really doing is you're excluding expenses that are either non-recurring or that will not exist post-transaction. Because remember, the buyer is looking at what their practice will look like in their hands. And they know they're not going to, all the expenses that will put through the practice will not continue going forward.
Thank you. Anyone else? Lou, we can't hear you.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. I had muted it. So if I could jump in a second, right? Without like overly simplifying, the work that Steve does, right? When you look at valuation, the typical valuation expert is going to value your company using 3 distinct approaches. One of which, the most important of which, is usually the income approach, which is, the looks at the net cash flow that Lee just highlighted, right? In fact, I remember when I was in business school, one of the items that my professor drilled into our heads was that, the value of something, whether it was equities, fixed income, or whatever, was usually related to the present value of the future cash flows, right? And I'm not going to go through over how that is done, but that is a very key thing that needs to be done. From the point of view of the practices, though, something that I see is that there's this tendency, especially on the part of the smaller companies, to link or to put expenses through the business that can be considered both business and personal. And so often when you go through the Adback process, there's this step that needs to be done in order to carve out the personal expenses. And over time, the bigger that you are, the less excuse you have for doing that. And so one thing that if you're really preparing to go to market is you should really start work with someone such as Lee and professionalize your firm, and little by little rely less on these expenses that really have nothing to do with running the practice.
I just want to jump in because the Adbacks issue comes up a lot for me during deal document negotiation. And then I think, unfortunately, it comes up sometimes post-closing. So, Lee mentioned entertainment. I've seen seller physician owners who have dinners with relatives that run through the business, multiple automobiles, family members on payroll. None of these things shock me when I see them. I'm sure all 3 of you see this as well. But when you get the add back credit, which increases purchase price in the transaction, you need to understand that you can no longer do those things after the closing. And I think buyers get very frustrated when we're past the financial negotiation, we're significantly far along with the purchase agreement, and the purchase price is fully baked, and then we start negotiating an employment agreement, and the physician starts asking for perks such as phones and computers and cars that they've already asked for credit in an add back. So you can't have it both ways. And then post-closing, if you've given it and you've gotten the add back credit, certainly don't keep doing it because you'll have a very angry buyer.
Great point. I know it happens in your world quite a bit. And like you said, post transaction is when you really are having those conversations, those difficult conversations at that point. Gentlemen, I am going to lob one last question out to you because we're approaching the top of the hour now. And I always like to end these sessions as far as we talk about all the things that are important and things that they need. And one situation kind of comes to mind. We were working on evaluation for someone that a physician wanted to buy a practice. And one of the things that they noticed is that there's got to be a lot of renovation that's going to be done. So that should intuitively affect the actual offering price that the physician is asking for in order to update it. There are a number of host of other things that probably should go into play, whether or not you're buying or selling. So I'll ask you, what are the don'ts? Whether they are as a physician that wants to buy into a practice, what they shouldn't do, or if they're selling a practice, what certain things they shouldn't do. And you can take it from either direction. It's up to you. So Lou, I'll start with you.
Okay. Awesome. So my job back in the day, before I worked as an M&A advisor, I was the chief operating officer of a medical group, and my job was literally to knock on the doors of different physicians and ask them if they were interested in selling our practice to us. And along the way, I discovered a couple of things that I didn't quite like the answer, and I think that these would constitute my don'ts, right? So the first was that whenever I asked physicians why they were selling, more often than not, they would tell me that they loved the practice of medicine, but they hated the business of medicine. And this was an answer that came back over and over and over again. But one thing that I want to emphasize is that you need to realize that if you're talking to an MBA such as myself, by telling me that you don't like the business of medicine and you're selling me your business, that really is not a very good answer. And so some of the things that I would see coming back were physicians would cut back on the number of hours that they would work in the last couple of years. They would get so fed up with all of the issues in healthcare that they would decrease the number of patients that they would see. And that obviously has an impact on profitability and on revenue and profitability. And as I mentioned before, that is a big part of valuation. So if you don't want to drop the value of your practice, don't cut back on your hours if you can afford to do it. Don't talk to just one buyer. I had many instances where I would approach somebody and I'd say, hey, we want to buy your practice. And they would say, no, thanks. I'm already talking to the hospital. And which I found kind of funny because back then when I was doing this, it was almost like 10 years ago, no one really wanted to sell to the hospital. They didn't like working for the hospital. They'd heard all these stories from their colleagues about, how it wasn't the greatest exit option. Now, I don't share that view, by the way. I think that hospitals are a viable option, but it doesn't matter. You wouldn't look for a job and just apply with one company. You should interview with others. You also should not get hung up on price because oftentimes someone will give you a very, very high price. And then when they carve it back in the different terms that they extract from you, and I'll leave that to Lee and to Mike to mention. And then don't forget to prepare, right? So your practice is your biggest asset. When I was a financial advisor, everybody always said your 401k is your biggest asset. But if you actually are an owner of a practice, that's probably your biggest asset. But it's one that you're only going to sell once, right? And so, but you're going to be selling it to someone who has made a significant number of acquisitions. So in some ways, you're at a bit of a disadvantage. And so I think the way to overcome that is to prepare, to educate yourself, to assemble a deal team, and to start very early.
Excellent. Any other comments before we close it out?
Yeah, I'll just add real quickly, just on top of what Lou said. Preparation is key. Start strategizing early on. Don't make an emotional decision. Stay focused on why you're looking to sell an interest, and also consider your partner. If you're going to stay on for the practice for some period of time, you want to make sure your new partner, whether it's a hospital, whether it's going to be a private equity platform partner, make sure you're comfortable with your partner.
Yeah, and I think both of Lee and Lou touched on this, but from my perspective, I firmly believe that time is the enemy of all deals. So the more swift and efficient that you can go through the deal process, the more likely you'll get to a successful transaction. I'm not saying that you should rush. I'm just saying that to the extent that you can control delays, you should. And the easiest way to do that is to be prepared. So from a sell side, Lou mentioned and Lee mentioned doing your own internal skinny down Q of E. I would also do your own internal skinny down due diligence so that you are prepared to do the buyer's due diligence and be responsive. And from a buyer's perspective, you should have your process, have a timeline, have your deal team set up, and streamline things. Nothing frustrates a seller more than getting the same due diligence question from your CPA, your attorney, your insurance company, and your financial advisors. So an ounce of preparation up front will really lead to a much more successful and hopefully lead to a closing.
Right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much again for taking time out to be a part of this. Your email information is here. I'll be forwarding this out to everyone that joined our webcast today. I'm sure, because we're against time now, if they have any other questions, I'm sure you all will welcome them reaching out to you to address anything that they may have. I do believe that this is truly a time period in which we are in, where transaction activity has picked up substantially, and there are a lot of questions out there. There are a lot of questions as far as, what do I need to have in place? What kind of documentation do I need in place? Is this the right market? Am I in the right time frame to actually transition my business? In order for those things to be addressed and answered correctly, as I started this presentation today, and I'll end it in the same way, you need to assemble yourself within a team of experts, not just someone who's an accountant, attorney, or a business broker. You need an expert in those particular fields. And that goes for evaluation as well. You need someone who is an expert in that particular field to guide you and walk you through that overall process. With that being said, I thank each of you for taking the time to be a part of this. If you need them, reach out. Of course, Onyx Partners Group is here. If you ever have any questions just from a consultation standpoint, as far as how the valuation process works, please feel free to reach out to us. And lastly, I would be remiss if I did not thank my team, because without them helping me put all this together, it probably wouldn't have happened. So I thank Hervé, Jill, Pedro as well. But more importantly, I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to be a part of this webinar. And I appreciate it. Lastly, stay safe, maintain your social distancing, and please reach out if you ever have any questions and anything that we can help you. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.